The internet loves for things to be to the extreme, and that probably has to do with our collective appetite for extreme experiences, especially when we get to have those experiences by proxy while sitting at home in a safe and comfortable environment. Horror movies are a great example. It can be fun and exciting to have your fight or flight response triggered when you know that you're not actually in any kind of danger. And hey, an adrenaline rush is a very natural kind of high. Similarly, it's not too surprising that so many pop songs are about the highs and lows of romantic relationships, and not so much about the less exciting in-between moments that actually make up the majority of any real-world relationship. Talking about the extremely good and extremely bad moments can trigger a powerful response in the listener, especially if the listener is currently going through something very similar. In fact, let's do a quick exercise. Just name an emotion, the first one that comes to mind. I'm gonna guess that most people just called out an emotion like anger, happiness, sadness, or fear, things like that. These are basic emotions that many of us are taught about as young children. But really, this is just the starter pack. There are many other, more specific emotions and feelings that we have names for. In fact, certain emotional theories treat those basic emotions as emotion categories, with each one containing multiple versions of each base emotion. For example, under the category of sadness, you'd have more specific descriptors like depressed, upset, detached, etc. And before we really get into the weeds here on emotional theory specifically, I will just give a quick disclaimer and say that, yeah, things are about to get much more complicated because discussion of emotions and emotional theory intersects with multiple fields of study, including psychology, anthropology, and sociology. And within each field, there are multiple theories being passed around all the time, and some of these theories conflict with one another. In other words, there's no single definitive understanding of emotion, and things only get more complicated when we start comparing different cultural understandings of emotion and the specific words that different languages use to refer to specific emotions. There are even emotions and combinations of emotions that are unique to certain cultures and historical periods. I know, this is a lot, but I mention all of this, A, because it's interesting and relevant to the discussion I'm about to have, and 2, because I want to let you know that the understanding of emotions that I'll be working from here isn't one that you have to agree with. For the purposes of this video, I will be separating emotions into 2 main categories. The first category is the basic, fundamental emotions that I mentioned earlier. Think of these as the inside-out emotions. These are terms that we're all familiar with, even if we each have our own subjective understandings of how they express themselves. These emotions are kind of like the basic set of Crayola crayons you had in grade 2 that only includes like 8 colors total. But these colors are not wholly representative of all colors visible to the human eye. The second category is more specific emotions or emotion combinations, and these are more subtle, and they're also generally more difficult to describe, I've found. And to go along with the crayon metaphor, these are all the other more specific colors that you'd only get with a massive set of crayons, one of the really big boxes. And I'll try to refer to these as pastel emotions. So this distinction between the 2 categories is important because what I want to talk about today is how popular media, more often than not, really only appeals to the basic Crayola kinds of emotions and not the pastel emotions. This is probably because appealing to the strong Crayola emotions is a relatively easy way to grab attention and evoke an enthusiastic response from the audience, but I'll talk more about that in detail later on. But right now, I'll just say that I think this current norm, this standard, is pretty unfortunate, and I'd like to explain why. Okay, so before we get back to discussion of media specifically, let's talk a bit more about emotional theory. Now, this is something that I've only dipped into myself fairly recently, so obviously I'm not an expert, but I find the topic incredibly interesting, and I recently finished an excellent anthropology book called Unnatural Emotions by Catherine Lutz. If you've been watching my stuff for a while, then you've probably heard me mention this one before. for. It's definitely worth a read if you're into this stuff, and I would like to share a few ideas presented in the conclusion of that book. Just to give like a basic description of what's going on in the book, Lutz uses her field work on a Micronesian atoll as the basis for an argument against dominant Western views of human emotion. Here's a quote: "The tendency to look at emotions in isolation from the social field has led to an emphasis on emotions as singular events situated within the individual rather than on emotional exchanges between individuals." Something about that phrase, singular events situated within the individual, really sounds recognizable to me as a viewpoint. She emphasizes the importance of considering many crucial external factors that influence our emotions and our understanding of these emotions. Quote, "The task for future comparative work on the relation between emotions and culture is to examine how the political, economic, social, and ecological conditions of life for particular people provide the impetus and framing for the emotional consciousness that develops among them." So with this in mind, the discussion we're about to have about the emotions that major movies and shows are trying to appeal to becomes even more interesting. We're talking about mass media here that is specifically researched and designed to be as appealing as possible to as many people as possible for the sake of bringing in huge amounts of cash. Audience approval of a particular media property, observable as record-breaking box office revenue and/or the receipt of major awards, is driven by the audience's emotional investment in the narrative. Approval of a movie or show also signals approval of its emotional content. So in other words, there are strong ties between our emotions and the environment we live in. And so there are also strong ties between the environment we live in and the emotional content of the media we love. So taking a closer look at the emotional content of popular movies and shows can tell us a lot about our own culture and how the emotional sphere of our culture is perceived by the people who make popular media. And our emotional understanding is affected in turn by popular media too, whether we like it or not. So yeah, that's why I think this is important to talk about. And this information can also help us pay closer attention to cultural differences in media and the emotional content of that media. Okay, whew, my gosh. I think we're ready to move on. Are you doing all right? I promise I'll try to keep the video relatively light, at least in terms of visuals, so hang in there. I appreciate you being here. When I was looking for examples of media that evokes what I'm calling the Crayola emotions, I was overwhelmed by options. If you look to basically any popular movies, music, books, video games, or even just internet videos, you will find Crayola emotions. And this doesn't just apply to contemporary media. This has been the case for decades. And today as well, in big studio movies especially, everything's as dramatic and extreme as can be, whether we're talking about superhero stuff or Oscar bait dramas, with a few exceptions. It's either about the end of the goddamn world or the most pivotal moments of the characters' lives. Reality shows, similarly, either through on-set coaching or editing, fill episodes up with loud, extreme, intense moments, which can result in an end product that often ends up feeling predatory, misleading, and manipulative, both of the on-screen talent as well as the show's audience. For many years now, the trend in high production value AAA video games is to mimic filmmaking, ushering the player from action to drama to more action to more drama, and people fall over themselves to say how impactful it is. Even the supposedly artful indie game scene tends to lean heavily into extreme depression, grief, or the trials and tribulations of love. And boy oh boy, Big View YouTube is probably the least subtle in its appeal to the Crayola emotions. Just look at the current thumbnail meta on the site. Everything is about crazy, dramatic, weird, over the top everything, to the point where these big channels will have people make these like insane caricature looking faces just for the sake of the thumbnail. These aren't even expressions that you'll ever see in the video itself a lot of the time. These are expressions specifically designed to make you think that the video is going to deliver emotionally blunt content. So why do people keep making all of this kind of stuff? Probably because it consistently performs well. And why does it consistently perform well? Because we've come to enjoy watching and responding to blunt emotional content. Just think of product or movie reviews on the internet. There's a reason that some of the big channels do their best to present the product as either extra good or extra bad with zero in between, because that brings people in. Would you rather watch a review saying that, I don't know, a keyboard is perfectly fine, or a review saying that it's personally offensive to the reviewer? The latter sounds more interesting, even if the first review might provide a more useful and nuanced take. Similarly, do you want to watch a movie about a crazy romantic fling? Or, I don't know, the enduring friendship of two middle-aged men? Indulging in Crayola content also affirms our own alignment with cultural norms when it comes to emotion. We know consciously and subconsciously how we're expected to respond to certain things. And especially if you're in a group, it feels good to have a shared emotional experience. When the sad thing happens, everybody feels sad. There's validation in that. In fact, I have this really strong memory of going to see a movie with a bunch of friends way back in middle school. It's the one called The Guardian. I had to look it up. Don't feel bad if you don't remember it. It's not a good movie. But yeah, spoiler, at the end of the movie, someone sacrifices themselves. And at the time, I didn't really have much of a reaction to that. I just kind of felt like, oh, this is a scene in a movie. I was very used to seeing that kind of thing happen in movies. I didn't react much. But then I noticed that every one of the girls that we'd gone along with were crying like crazy through the whole scene, and they continued to cry until the end of the movie. And I'm not saying that reaction was strange. It made perfect sense in that context, but it also forced me to question why I didn't have the same reaction. And if I had made a point of not having the same reaction, if I had made a big deal out of that, it definitely would have had a negative impact on how I was viewed by my peers, regardless of my reasoning. In reality, it was really just because I found the movie boring, but it's also understandable that many people use the emotional content of a movie and the expected response to that content as a kind of yardstick for determining someone else's or even their own emotional sensitivity. Now, so far, I've made out Crayola content to be a negative thing on the whole, and I will get back to doing that in just a second, but I would also like to take a moment to add a very important asterisk. The Crayola emotions, in and of themselves, are not bad at all. If we suddenly stopped representing and appealing to those emotions, that would be a serious mistake. Feeling the Crayola emotions in your everyday life isn't somehow like less refined or stupid or basic. I'm really not going after the emotions themselves at all. They are integral to the human experience. And especially for someone going through a difficult time in their own life, it can be cathartic to consume media that speaks to these emotions in a meaningful way. Also, and this is pretty obvious, but I'll say it anyway, tons of successful, artful, well-crafted media has been built around the Crayola emotions, and that's something to be celebrated. However, if you know my work here on the channel, then you know that I really like to criticize norms that I view as being problematic. And in my experience, bad Crayola content, not all of it, can feel A, overdone, B, lazy, and C, manipulative. And I don't want to support media that is any of these things. In terms of being overdone and lazy, I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, especially if you're already a cynic and you're familiar with big Hollywood movies. It's really not that hard to kill the cat, so to speak, and make the audience feel things. And in terms of being outright manipulative, there's the tried and true method of slamming the audience with heavy emotional content so that they'll give you money and encourage other people to give you money. But even beyond that, Crayola emotions have also been the go-to of, for example, like propagandists for decades or maybe even centuries. Propaganda films are Crayola all the way through, with little to no time for any sense of subtlety. Just look to stuff like The Cranes Are Flying and Soy Cuba. Really great looking movies, but god-awful stories. So while Crayola content has all these potential downsides, I also think that there are many benefits to media that goes beyond the Crayola spectrum. And I would like to talk about some of those benefits right now. We've all felt things that can't be accurately described by those broad strokes labels that we talked about earlier, by the Crayola emotion words. Some of these feelings may not even have names as far as we're aware of, and other ones may only have names in other languages. For example, there's a Dutch word that I was introduced to when I was doing my study abroad. The word is gezelligheid, sorry for the pronunciation, and it refers to a feeling that we don't have an exact translation for. It's basically a combination of like coziness and conviviality and potentially fellowship. So what I'm saying is that people are complicated and they feel all kinds of ways about what's going on in their lives as well as the world at large. And in my experience, when one of these complex feelings hits home, it really hits. I think it's generally easier to find this more subtle kind of emotional content in not so popular media, such as like fancy pants art house movies and the fine arts. I can easily think of plenty of foreign movies, for example, that capture a much more subtle emotional tone than the average studio flick. Jeune Diamant is a big one. I named my cat after that movie. It's incredibly quiet overall, both literally and in terms of tone, at least until a certain point. Basically any movie from Andrei Tarkovsky, The Mirror, Stalker, Solaris. I don't think these movies can be described through the use of simple emotion words at all. Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, one of my personal favorites, is stuffed with complex emotional content. Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I've talked about that one a lot. And before I move on, I want to describe a way that you can go ahead and test out a movie to determine whether it has complex emotional content. Basically, you can ask yourself how a particular scene makes you feel, or how you think a character feels in a particular scene. If your answer is something like sad, then it might not be the most emotionally complex piece of work, but if a more specific term comes to mind, or if you can't seem to find the right word at all, it might be more complex. So let's put this into practice. Many of Miyazaki's films with Studio Ghibli contain so much more than just the base emotions that I think we tend to think of. So let's compare scenes from a very good Miyazaki film, Spirited Away, to some scenes from a very good Pixar film, Ratatouille. I'll try to describe the tone of each of these scenes, and we'll try to use that as a point of comparison. I would describe that scene as like exciting, tense, I guess. I think that fits just fine. For this one, I guess I would describe it as mysterious for one thing, potentially wistful. It's a funny scene, it's heartwarming, generally very light. Okay, I guess I would describe it as hectic. There's an uncomfortable, undertone to the whole thing, even though we have a lot of characters just seeming very happy. There's a sinister quality to it as well. I would describe this as hopeful, satisfying, maybe optimistic. I don't really know where to start. It's kind of sad, I guess, but it's also kind of neutral and calming. It feels like an in-between sensation that almost summarizes childhood in a way. So to sum up, Ratatouille often has a sense of tone that is clearly defined and straightforward. But in contrast, scenes in Spirited Away can feel like there are multiple underlying forces pulling in different directions at once. But even beyond any examples that I could try to concoct, I think that this is a difference that can be felt intuitively. How you feel during each of these scenes is very different. Personally, I think the unique tones captured by Spirited Away and plenty of other Miyazaki movies are a big part of why those movies have remained so beloved. They deliver something different. And when I return to any Pixar movie in comparison, I don't know, when I start to analyze, it kind of feels like it ends up being a much simpler vacillation of happy, sad, happy, sad, happy, sad. And given that Spirited Away, in this comparison, comes to us from Japan, I have to wonder if some of the difference that I'm noticing here is rooted in a distinct cultural understanding of emotion that I'm just unfamiliar with. And because I'm unfamiliar with Japan's cultural understanding of emotion, I can't say whether that's it for sure. It could be that I'm just noticing the distinct creative approach of this particular group of animators. But I can say pretty definitively that the emotional content of Spirited Away and other Ghibli films feels different. And I also have a hunch that the enduring popularity of these movies is tied to their distinct emotional palettes. I think that so many people continue to remember these movies so fondly and rewatch them over and over because it confirms just how great it can be to experience media that has something to offer beyond the Crayola colors. It's incredibly rewarding to discover a work of art that illuminates an aspect of the emotional spectrum that rarely receives attention. At the same time, I think I have a pretty good understanding of why it's rare to come across the pastel emotions in big budget, production line kind of movies. It would make many steps of the filmmaking process more difficult. I mean, just imagine pitching a script with tons of pastel emotions. Imagine trying to execute a scene meant to make the audience feel, say, wistful instead of just sad. Imagine marketing a movie whose emotional content is just plain difficult to describe. And especially nowadays, filling a piece of media with blunt Crayola emotions can encourage members of the audience to do some marketing for free. They feel affected by the work, and so they hop onto social media and promote the work by talking about how much it affected them. But I've definitely gotten to a point where I just don't care all that much about Crayola content. I've seen it done very well. I've seen it done very poorly. And just in general, I have seen it so darn much. And I hope that I've done a decent job of explaining why it's worth seeking out media that doesn't deliver only the basic colors. In particular, I think that aspiring artists of any discipline should try to expose themselves to as much of this pastel emotional content as possible. I mean, after all, we're people, and we need more than 8 crayons to tell our stories. Wow, we finally made it to the end. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope I did an okay job. I don't know, I feel like people might get mad at me for suggesting that movies that tend to rely on appeals to the more basic emotions as I've described here are bad. That's definitely not what I think. Definitely not 100% of the time. Even Ratatouille, I mean, that's one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm not trying to trash the movie, but I am just trying to illustrate that you can get variety in terms of emotional content. And for whatever reason, maybe for some of the reasons I outlined here, maybe for reasons I just don't understand, it is relatively rare. I just don't see it happening as often. That's almost a good thing because it highlights just how exciting and how fulfilling it can be to stumble across something that does get to that spot. You know what I mean? It gets to the spot that hasn't been itched in a very long time. And I just want to highlight that experience and hopefully encourage people to kind of seek that out. Not trying to say everything else that doesn't fit that description is bad. Not trying to tell you to stop watching big studio movies, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, I hope I've done a decent job of making my case, and I really do appreciate the support that you've given by making it to the end of the video. But I think that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.